Behind the golden gates and pristine facades of royalty lies a truth that would make any parent's heart break. When Prince William discovered the silent tears his daughter Princess Charlotte had been hiding, everything he thought he knew about protecting his family crumbled in an instant. This isn't just another royal story about duty and tradition. This is about a father who had to choose between the crown that shaped him and the child who needed him most. What started as a routine family evening would become the moment that changed the British royal family forever. Because sometimes, love demands we confront the very institutions we've spent our lives defending. The evening started like any other at Adelaide Cottage. Prince William had just returned from a day of royal engagements, his formal attire replaced with comfortable casual clothes as he prepared to spend precious time with his children. The October air carried a crisp promise of winter, and the warm glow from the cottage windows painted a picture of domestic tranquility that the public rarely glimpsed. Catherine was in the kitchen, helping George with his mathematics homework, while Louis played with his toy soldiers on the living room carpet. The sounds of family life filled the space, laughter mixing with the gentle scolding that comes with bedtime routines. William felt that familiar sense of contentment that only came when he was home, away from the cameras and protocols that governed so much of his existence. But something felt different tonight. As he climbed the stairs to check on the children before dinner, he noticed Charlotte's bedroom door was closed. This was unusual for his typically social daughter, who preferred to keep her door open so she could hear all the family conversations happening below. William paused outside her room, listening for the sounds of play or the soft humming that usually accompanied her evening activities. Instead, he heard something that made his heart clench with immediate concern. It was quiet crying, the kind that children do when they're trying desperately not to be heard. The sound was muffled, as if Charlotte had buried her face in her pillow to contain the sobs that were escaping despite her best efforts. William's parental instincts kicked in immediately.
He knocked gently on the door, his voice soft and encouraging.
"Charlotte, sweetheart, may I come in?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by hurried shuffling sounds as his daughter clearly tried to compose herself. "Just a minute, Papa," came Charlotte's voice, high and strained with the effort of trying to sound normal. William waited, counting the seconds, and feeling increasingly worried about what could have upset his usually resilient daughter so deeply. When Charlotte finally opened the door, William's heart broke a little. Her eyes were red and puffy, her cheeks streaked with tears she'd tried to wipe away. She was still in her school uniform, though it was rumpled and disheveled. Most concerning of all was the way she seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to become invisible. "What's wrong, my love?" William asked, crouching down to her eye level. This was something he'd learned from his own difficult childhood, the importance of meeting children where they were, literally and figuratively. Charlotte looked away, her small hands twisting together in a gesture William recognized as inherited anxiety. "Nothing, Papa. I'm just tired from school." But her voice wavered as she said it, and William knew his perceptive daughter was trying to protect him from something. He gently guided her to sit on her bed, the same bed where he'd read countless bedtime stories and had whispered conversations about dreams and fears. The room was decorated with her artwork and photos of family moments, a testament to a childhood that should have been carefree and joyful. "Charlotte," William said carefully, "you know you can tell me anything, right? No matter what it is, no matter how big or small it seems, I want to help." For a moment, Charlotte seemed to consider this. Her lower lip trembled, and William could see the internal battle she was fighting between the desire to confide in her father and some other force that was keeping her silent. "The children at school," she finally whispered, so quietly that William had to lean closer to hear her. "They say things about us, about our family." William felt a familiar protective anger begin to build, but he kept his voice calm and encouraging. "What kind of things, sweetheart?" Charlotte's eyes filled with fresh tears. "They say we think we're better than everyone else, that we live in a palace and never have to work for anything. They say..." She paused, struggling with words that were clearly too heavy for her young shoulders. "They say that people have to bow to us and that it's not fair." The innocence in her voice as she repeated these criticisms cut through William like a blade. He realized that his daughter was grappling with concepts that even adults struggled to understand. The complex relationship between privilege, duty, and fairness that defined royal existence. "And what do you think about that?" William asked gently, though he was already beginning to understand the depth of Charlotte's distress. "I don't want people to bow to me, Papa," Charlotte said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to be different from my friends. Sometimes I wish we were just a normal family who could go to the shops without people taking pictures, or live in a house that didn't have guards. William pulled his daughter into his arms, feeling the weight of generations of royal burdens settling on his chest. This was the conversation he'd dreaded and hoped might come later, when Charlotte was older and better equipped to understand the complexities of their position. "There's more," Charlotte continued, her face pressed against his shoulder. "Some of the older children say that our great-great-grandmother did terrible things to their countries. They say their grandparents had to fight against the British Empire and that we still benefit from all the hurt that was caused." William felt his world tilt slightly. These were not the simple playground taunts he'd experienced as a child. These were sophisticated political and historical criticisms that reflected a changing world and a generation of young people who were asking difficult questions about inherited power and historical injustices. "And Mrs. Henderson, my history teacher," Charlotte went on, "she taught us about colonialism last week. She didn't say anything directly about our family, but afterward, everyone was looking at me funny, like I was responsible for things that happened before I was even born." The complexity of Charlotte's situation began to dawn on William fully. His daughter wasn't just dealing with typical royal scrutiny. She was confronting a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy and morality of the institution she'd been born into. At 9 years old, she was being forced to defend or reject a legacy she'd had no part in creating. "I asked Granny about it," Charlotte continued, referring to her great-grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth. "But she just said that duty comes before personal feelings and that we must always remember we serve the people, even when they don't understand." William felt a surge of protectiveness mixed with frustration. His grandmother's response, while reflecting decades of royal protocol, seemed inadequate for helping a child navigate such complex emotional and moral territory. "But Papa," Charlotte said, pulling back to look at him with eyes that seemed far too mature for her age, "what if the people don't want us to serve them? What if they're right that it's not fair for us to have so much when others have so little?" The question hung in the air between them, and William realized that this moment would define not just his relationship with his daughter, but possibly his approach to the monarchy itself. Charlotte wasn't just asking about playground politics. She was asking fundamental questions about justice, fairness, and the role of inherited privilege in a democratic society. As he looked into his daughter's troubled eyes, William made a decision that would set in motion events none of them could have predicted. Instead of offering the traditional royal responses about duty and service, he decided to give Charlotte something that had been lacking in his own upbringing: complete honesty about the challenges and contradictions of their position. "Those are very good questions, Charlotte," he said finally. "And I think it's time we had some very honest conversations, not just you and me, but our whole family, about what it really means to be part of the royal family in today's world." Charlotte looked surprised by this response. She'd clearly expected to be told to simply ignore the criticism or to focus on their duty to serve. Instead, her father was suggesting that her concerns were valid and deserving of serious consideration. "But what about duty, Papa? What about serving the people like Granny always said?" William took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would mark a departure from generations of royal tradition. "Duty is important, sweetheart, but so is making sure that our service actually helps people and doesn't cause harm. And if what we're doing isn't working for the people we're supposed to serve, then maybe we need to change how we do it." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Catherine eventually joining them as they explored Charlotte's concerns together. What became clear was that Charlotte's distress wasn't just about playground teasing. It was about a fundamental crisis of conscience that reflected broader questions about the monarchy's place in the modern world. By the time Charlotte finally fell asleep that night, William had made a decision that would change everything. He would not simply comfort his daughter and hope the problem would resolve itself. Instead, he would confront the institution that had shaped his entire life and demand answers that went beyond traditional platitudes about duty and service. The next morning, as William watched Charlotte reluctantly prepare for school, he saw the careful way she arranged her expression to hide her inner turmoil. His bright, compassionate daughter was learning to wear a mask of royal composure, and the sight filled him with a determination he'd never felt before. This was not the childhood he wanted for any of his children. And if that meant challenging the very foundations of the monarchy itself, then that was exactly what he intended to do. The days following William's conversation with Charlotte were marked by a growing sense of urgency. He found himself observing his daughter more carefully, noting the subtle changes in her behavior that he'd previously missed. Charlotte had become quieter at family dinners, more withdrawn during their weekend activities, and increasingly reluctant to discuss school when asked. William decided to conduct his own investigation, starting with a conversation with Charlotte's headmistress at her prestigious London preparatory school. The meeting was arranged under the guise of a routine parental check-in, but William came prepared with specific questions about his daughter's social integration and academic experience. Mrs. Whitfield, the headmistress, received William in her wood-panelled office with the kind of nervous respect that royal visits typically generated. She was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a reputation for progressive education that had initially attracted William and Catherine to the school. "Your Royal Highness," she began formally, "Princess Charlotte is an exemplary student. Her academic performance is excellent, and she's generally well liked by her peers." William leaned forward slightly. "Generally well liked? That suggests there might be some exceptions." Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "There have been some discussions among the children lately. Nothing serious, of course, but you know how young people can be when they're exploring complex social and political concepts." "What kind of discussions?" William pressed, his voice gentle but insistent. The headmistress sighed, recognizing that evasion would not satisfy the concerned father sitting across from her. "The children have been asking questions about inequality, about privilege, about historical injustices. It's part of our expanded curriculum on global citizenship and social responsibility. We believe it's important for young people to understand these concepts." William nodded, appreciating the school's commitment to education that went beyond traditional academic subjects. "And how does this affect Charlotte specifically?" "Some of the older students have been, shall we say, particularly vocal about their views on inherited privilege. They're not targeting Charlotte maliciously, but they are using her family as an example in their discussions about fairness and social justice." The picture was becoming clearer. Charlotte wasn't being bullied in the traditional sense. She was being used as a case study in discussions about systemic inequality. In some ways, this was even more challenging to address than simple playground meanness. "What's the school's position on these discussions?" William asked. Mrs. Whitfield chose her words carefully. "We believe in fostering critical thinking and social awareness. However, we also recognize that some of our students face unique challenges due to their family backgrounds. We're trying to balance educational goals with pastoral care." After leaving the school, William decided to dig deeper. He arranged informal meetings with other parents, palace staff, and even some of his own friends to understand the broader context of what Charlotte was experiencing. Sarah, the mother of one of Charlotte's classmates, spoke candidly about the discussions happening among the children and parents. "The kids are so much more politically aware than we were at their age," she explained over coffee at a quiet cafe in Kensington. "They're asking questions that make us adults uncomfortable. My daughter Emma came home last week asking why some people are born into wealth and power while others struggle to survive." William found himself in the unusual position of defending an institution he was increasingly questioning himself. "And what did you tell her?"
That life isn't fair, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make it more fair," Sarah replied.
But then Emma asked specifically about Charlotte, about whether it's right that she'll someday have power over other people just because of who her family is. These conversations revealed the depth of the challenge Charlotte was facing. She wasn't just dealing with curiosity about royal life. She was confronting fundamental questions about democratic values, social justice, and inherited power that were being discussed seriously by children her own age. William's investigation expanded to include conversations with palace advisors and courtiers. He met with Sir Edward Morrison, the Queen's former private secretary, who had served the royal family for over 3 decades. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edward said during their private meeting at Clarence House, "these concerns are not unprecedented. Every generation of royal children has faced scrutiny and criticism. The institution has weathered far more serious challenges than school-age political discussions." But William wasn't satisfied with historical precedent. "This feels different, Edward. Charlotte isn't just dealing with media attention or public curiosity. She's being forced to defend the fundamental legitimacy of our existence as a royal family." Sir Edward's expression grew more serious. "Perhaps it's time she learned that such defense is part of her duty. The monarchy has always required its members to bear criticism with dignity and grace." The response troubled William deeply. He was beginning to see a pattern in the institutional responses to Charlotte's distress, an expectation that she should simply endure and adapt rather than an acknowledgement that her concerns might be valid. His investigation took him next to conversations with historians and political scientists who could provide context for the questions Charlotte was encountering. Rebecca Chen, a professor of constitutional history at Cambridge, offered insights that proved particularly illuminating. "The challenges facing young royals today are unprecedented in some ways," she explained during a confidential meeting. Previous generations of royal children grew up in societies where monarchical authority was less questioned. Today's young people are growing up with access to global perspectives on democracy, human rights, and social justice that make inherited privilege much harder to justify. Dr. Chen's research had focused on the evolution of constitutional monarchy, and she had specific insights about the current situation. Princess Charlotte is coming of age at a time when the very concepts that underpin monarchical legitimacy are being fundamentally challenged. She's not just facing personal criticism, she's confronting a philosophical crisis. William asked the question that had been haunting him since his conversation with Charlotte. In your professional opinion, is the monarchy still relevant and justifiable in today's world? Dr. Bird. Chen paused thoughtfully. That's ultimately a question for society to answer through democratic processes. But I will say this. Any institution that wants to survive must be able to justify its existence based on the value it provides to society, not simply on historical precedent. Chen led William to seek out other experts, including economists who studied wealth inequality, sociologists who researched the effects of privilege on child development, and even child psychologists who could help him understand how Charlotte's situation was affecting her emotional well-being. Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist who specialized in working with high-profile families, provided insights that were both reassuring and concerning. Children Charlotte's age are naturally developing their sense of fairness and justice, she explained. When they encounter situations that seem to contradict these developing moral frameworks, it can cause significant distress. Charlotte's response is actually quite healthy. She's showing empathy and moral reasoning. But Dr. Foster also warned about potential long-term effects. If Charlotte's concerns aren't addressed in a way that helps her integrate her moral values with her family identity, she could develop significant psychological conflicts. Some children in similar situations have experienced identity crises, anxiety, and depression. The investigation also led William to examine Charlotte's behavior more carefully at home. He began to notice patterns he'd previously overlooked. Charlotte had become reluctant to wear certain clothes that marked her as different from her peers. She'd stopped mentioning school friends by name, suggesting possible social isolation. Most concerning, she'd begun asking questions about whether she could choose not to be a princess when she grew up. Catherine, who had been observing these changes as well, shared her own concerns during one of their evening conversations. She asked me yesterday if we could move to Canada and live like normal people, Catherine confided. When I asked her why, she said she wanted to know what it felt like to earn things instead of having them given to her. The comment revealed the depth of Charlotte's internal struggle. She wasn't just uncomfortable with royal privilege, she was questioning whether she deserved the advantages that came with her birth. William's investigation culminated in a conversation with his father, King Charles, who had his own experiences with public scrutiny and institutional pressure. The meeting took place at Highgrove House, in the informal setting that Charles preferred for family discussions. Charlotte is experiencing something we've all faced, Charles said as they walked through his beloved gardens. The question is how we help her navigate it while maintaining the dignity and stability of the institution. But William was no longer content with traditional approaches. What if the institution needs to change, Father? What if Charlotte's concerns are pointing to real problems that we need to address? Charles paused in his walking, turning to face his son with an expression of surprise and concern. William, the monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years precisely because it has been able to adapt gradually while maintaining essential stability. Dramatic changes in response to the concerns of one child, however beloved, could have consequences none of us can predict. The conversation with his father made William realize that his investigation had revealed a fundamental divide in how different generations viewed the monarchy's challenges. The older generation saw Charlotte's distress as something to be managed and overcome through traditional means. William was beginning to see it as a call for fundamental change. As his investigation drew to a close, William compiled his findings into a private report that he shared with no one. The conclusions were both clear and troubling. Charlotte's distress was not a temporary phase or a manageable public relations challenge. It was a symptom of deeper contradictions between the values she was being taught as a global citizen and the reality of her position as a member of an inherited aristocracy. The report also revealed that Charlotte's situation was likely to become more challenging, not less, as she grew older and became more aware of global inequalities and historical injustices. Traditional royal responses of duty, service, and stoic acceptance were proving inadequate for addressing the moral complexity of her position. Most significantly, William's investigation had convinced him that protecting Charlotte's well-being might require challenging the very institution he'd been born to serve. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. setting the stage for confrontations that would test every relationship and assumption he'd ever held about his role as a future king and a father. Armed with the insights from his investigation, William knew that the time for gentle conversations and diplomatic approaches had passed. Charlotte's situation was deteriorating, and the traditional royal response of patience and gradual adaptation was proving insufficient. He decided that direct confrontation with the palace establishment was necessary, even if it meant challenging relationships and protocols that had governed his entire life. William's first major confrontation came during a scheduled meeting with the Queen's senior advisors at Buckingham Palace. The meeting had originally been planned to discuss routine matters related to his royal duties, but William had decided to use the opportunity to raise Charlotte's situation and demand institutional changes. The ornate conference room was filled with the familiar faces of palace hierarchy: Sir Edward Morrison, the Queen's private secretary; Dame Margaret Thornley, the keeper of the Privy Purse; and several other senior courtiers who had served the royal family for decades. These were people who had watched William grow up, who had guided his development as a future king, and who expected his continued cooperation with established protocols. William began the meeting with characteristic politeness, but quickly shifted to the real purpose of his presence. "I need to discuss a serious family matter that has broader implications for how we operate as an institution," he announced, noting the slight stiffening of posture around the table. He proceeded to outline Charlotte's situation with clinical precision, describing her distress, the conversations he'd had with school officials, and the broader context of questioning that his daughter was facing. The room grew increasingly uncomfortable as William detailed the specifics of Charlotte's concerns about inherited privilege and historical injustices. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edward interrupted gently, "with respect, these are challenges that every generation of royal children has faced. Princess Charlotte will learn to navigate these waters as you and your father did before her." William's response was sharper than his usual diplomatic tone. "No, Edward, this is different. Charlotte isn't just dealing with media attention or public curiosity. She's being asked to defend the moral legitimacy of an institution that she had no choice in joining, and frankly, I'm not sure we're giving her adequate tools for that defense." Dame Margaret leaned forward with a patronizing smile. "Perhaps your Royal Highness might consider that 9 years old is rather young to be grappling with such complex philosophical questions. Children Charlotte's age often go through phases of questioning authority." The dismissive tone triggered something in William that surprised even him. "Dame Margaret, I've spent weeks investigating this situation. I've spoken with educators, historians, child psychologists, and other parents. Dame Margaret, this is not a phase. This is a symptom of fundamental contradictions in our position that we've been ignoring for too long." The room fell silent. William had never spoken to senior palace officials with such directness, and the breach of protocol was palpable. But he pressed on, knowing that this moment might be his only opportunity to demand real change. "I want to know what this institution is doing to address the legitimate concerns that Charlotte and other young people are raising about inherited privilege and democratic accountability," he continued. "I want to know how we justify our position in a world where such justifications are increasingly expected and scrutinized." Sir Edward's response reflected decades of institutional thinking. "Your Royal Highness, the monarchy's legitimacy comes from constitutional tradition, democratic consent through Parliament, and centuries of service to the British people. We don't need to justify our existence to school children." William stood up abruptly, his composure finally cracking. "We absolutely do need to justify our existence, Edward. If we can't explain to a 9-year-old why our family deserves special treatment, then maybe we don't deserve it." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything the assembled advisors had dedicated their careers to supporting. Dame Margaret looked genuinely shocked, while Sir Edward's expression suggested he was witnessing a potential constitutional crisis. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edward said carefully, "these questions you're raising strike at the very foundation of constitutional monarchy. They're not matters that can be resolved in family meetings or policy adjustments. They're fundamental questions about the nature of our democratic system." William sat back down, but his posture remained tense. "Then maybe it's time we started having those fundamental conversations instead of pretending the questions will go away." The meeting continued for another hour, with William pressing for specific changes in how the royal family engaged with questions about privilege and accountability. He demanded that palace communications develop new approaches to addressing historical issues raised by critics. He insisted that educational programs be developed to help royal children understand and articulate their role in modern democratic society. Most controversially, he suggested that the royal family should proactively address questions about wealth inequality and historical injustices rather than waiting for criticism to arise. The response from the senior advisors was predictably resistant. They argued that such proactive engagement would legitimize criticism and potentially undermine the monarchy's stability. They insisted that the traditional approach of dignified service and gradual adaptation had served the institution well for centuries. As the meeting concluded, Sir Edward made one final attempt at reconciliation. "Your Royal Highness, might I suggest that Princess Charlotte would benefit from additional tutoring on constitutional history and the role of monarchy in modern democracy? Perhaps if she better understood the theoretical foundations of our system, she would be less troubled by the criticism she's encountering."
William's response was immediate and sharp.
"Edward, Charlotte understands perfectly well. That's exactly the problem. She understands enough to see the contradictions, and we're not providing adequate responses to address them." The confrontation with palace advisors was only the beginning. William realized that creating meaningful change would require challenging authority at the highest levels, including difficult conversations with his own father. The meeting with King Charles was arranged for the following week at Windsor Castle, in the private study that had been used for sensitive family discussions for generations. William arrived with notes and documentation from his investigation, prepared for what he knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. Charles received his son with the formal courtesy that marked their official interactions, but William could sense underlying tension. Word of his confrontation with palace advisors had clearly reached the king's ears. "William," Charles began, "I understand you've been raising concerns about Charlotte's school experiences. I appreciate your desire to protect your daughter, but I'm told your approach has been somewhat unconventional." William had prepared for this moment, knowing that his father's response would largely determine whether meaningful change was possible. "Father, Charlotte is suffering. She's being forced to defend an institution that she's beginning to see as fundamentally unfair. And, honestly, I'm struggling to help her because I'm not sure I disagree with her concerns." The admission was perhaps the most honest statement William had ever made to his father about his own relationship with the monarchy. Charles's expression shifted from formal concern to genuine alarm. "William, you're talking about questioning the very foundation of our constitutional role. These are not matters of family policy. These are questions that could affect the stability of the realm." William leaned forward in his chair, meeting his father's gaze directly. "Father, what if the realm would be more stable if we addressed these questions honestly rather than pretending they don't exist? What if Charlotte's generation is asking the right questions and we're giving the wrong answers?" The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had. Charles spoke about the weight of tradition, the importance of institutional stability, and the dangers of rapid change to constitutional arrangements. William countered with evidence from his investigation, stories of Charlotte's distress, and arguments about the need for moral legitimacy in democratic societies. "You're asking me to consider changes that could fundamentally alter the monarchy's relationship with the British people," Charles said finally. "Changes that could have consequences none of us can predict." William's response reflected weeks of careful thought and growing conviction. "I'm asking you to consider whether the monarchy's current relationship with the British people is sustainable, and I'm telling you that if we don't find better answers to the questions Charlotte is asking, we're going to lose the next generation entirely." The meeting ended without resolution, but with an agreement to continue the conversations. Charles had clearly been shaken by the intensity of William's convictions and the depth of Charlotte's distress. For the first time, he seemed to recognize that traditional approaches might be insufficient for addressing contemporary challenges. William's confrontations extended beyond palace officials and his father. He arranged a private meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, seeking spiritual and moral guidance for the questions Charlotte was raising. The Archbishop, who had officiated at William's wedding and was deeply involved in contemporary discussions about social justice, offered perspectives that proved both challenging and supportive. "Your Royal Highness," the Archbishop said during their confidential meeting, "the questions Princess Charlotte is asking are fundamentally theological as well as political. They concern justice, fairness, and the proper use of power and privilege. These are questions that any person of faith must grapple with seriously." The Archbishop's support for taking Charlotte's concerns seriously provided William with important validation. Here was a moral authority who agreed that the questions she was asking deserved serious consideration rather than dismissal. But the confrontations also revealed the extent of resistance William would face in seeking institutional change. During a heated discussion with Dame Margaret about financial transparency and wealth inequality, she made a statement that crystallized the fundamental divide. Your Royal Highness, if we start questioning the legitimacy of inherited privilege, where does it end? The entire structure of British society, from the House of Lords to private school systems to inherited wealth, is built on similar principles. We cannot undermine one without calling all the rest into question. William's response surprised even himself with its clarity and conviction. Dame Margaret, maybe that's exactly what we need to do. Maybe it's time to call all of it into question. The statement represented a point of no return in William's thinking. He was no longer simply seeking to help Charlotte navigate royal life. He was beginning to question whether royal life, as currently constituted, was something she should have to navigate at all. As word of his confrontation spread through palace circles, William found himself increasingly isolated from traditional sources of support. Longtime family friends expressed concern about his radical thinking. Senior military officials who had worked with him worried about his commitment to constitutional stability. Even some members of Parliament who had previously supported the royal family began to question whether William was suitable for future kingship. But William also discovered unexpected sources of support. Younger palace staff members privately expressed appreciation for his willingness to address difficult questions. Some members of the clergy reached out to offer theological perspectives on justice and privilege. Academic experts who had previously been critical of the monarchy began to see possibilities for meaningful reform. Most importantly, Charlotte herself began to show signs of relief as she witnessed her father's willingness to take her concerns seriously. The secret burden she had been carrying, the sense that her family's position was morally indefensible, began to lighten as she saw that the adults in her life were willing to engage with the difficult questions rather than dismissing them. The confrontations had established new battle lines within the royal family and palace establishment. On one side were those who believed in the necessity of gradual change within traditional frameworks. On the other side was William, increasingly convinced that protecting his daughter's well-being and moral development might require fundamental changes to the institution itself. The stage was set for even more dramatic confrontations as William prepared to challenge not just palace advisors and family members, but the basic assumptions about monarchy that had shaped British society for centuries. The confrontations within palace walls had established William's determination to seek change, but they had also revealed the enormous resistance he would face from institutional forces. As autumn turned to winter, Charlotte's situation at school continued to deteriorate despite William's efforts, making it clear that internal palace discussions were insufficient to address the broader social and political context of her struggles. William decided to expand his challenge beyond the confines of royal protocol by seeking direct conversations with critics of the monarchy and experts in democratic governance. This decision represented a dramatic departure from traditional royal behavior, where criticism was typically ignored or addressed only through formal communications channels. His first meeting outside palace circles was with Dr. Amara Okafor, a political scientist at the London School of Economics who had written extensively about the democratic deficit in constitutional monarchies. The meeting was arranged through intermediaries and conducted in absolute secrecy, as any public knowledge of such discussions would have created a constitutional crisis. Dr. Okafor, a woman in her 40s whose research focused on post-colonial governance and democratic legitimacy, received William in her cluttered academic office with a mixture of surprise and professional curiosity. The presence of a future king seeking dialogue with a known Republican critic was unprecedented in modern British history. "Your Royal Highness," she began cautiously, "I must admit I'm uncertain about the purpose of this meeting. My work has been quite critical of monarchical institutions." William settled into the uncomfortable chair across from her desk, surrounded by books that challenged everything he'd been taught about his role and purpose. "Dr. Okafor, that's exactly why I'm here. My daughter is facing criticisms of our family that I cannot adequately address using traditional royal responses. I need to understand these criticisms more deeply." What followed was perhaps the most challenging intellectual conversation of William's life. Dr. Okafor outlined systematic critiques of inherited power, the democratic problems created by unelected heads of state, and the ways that monarchical wealth and privilege contributed to social inequality. She spoke about the psychological effects of deference on both subjects and royals, and the ways that constitutional monarchy constrained democratic development. "The fundamental problem," Dr. Okafor explained, "is that monarchy requires people to accept that some individuals are inherently more worthy of power and privilege than others. This acceptance undermines the democratic principle that all citizens are equal and have equal claims to participate in governance. William found himself defending positions he was no longer sure he believed. But constitutional monarchy provides stability and continuity. The royal family serves as a unifying symbol above partisan politics. Okafor's response was gentle but devastating. Your Royal Highness, those arguments assume that stability and unity cannot be achieved through democratic means. Many republics provide both stability and unity through elected leaders and democratic institutions. The question is whether the benefits you describe are worth the costs in democratic legitimacy and social equality. The conversation forced William to confront questions he had never seriously considered. If the monarchy's primary justification was providing stability and unity, why couldn't those benefits be achieved through democratic institutions? If service to the people was the royal family's purpose, why couldn't that service be performed by elected officials accountable to voters?
Most unsettling was Dr.
Okafor's analysis of the psychological effects of monarchy on both rulers and subjects. Children born into royal families are denied the fundamental human right to choose their own purpose and identity, she argued. They're forced to accept roles they didn't choose and responsibilities they may not want. Meanwhile, other citizens are taught to see themselves as inherently less worthy of power and privilege. As William listened, he began to understand Charlotte's distress in a new context. His daughter wasn't just struggling with peer criticism. She was intuiting the fundamental unfairness of a system that denied her autonomy while simultaneously elevating her above her peers without justification. The meeting with Dr. Okafor was followed by other equally challenging conversations. William met with historians who specialized in the transition from monarchy to democracy in other European countries. He spoke with economists who studied wealth concentration and its effects on social mobility. He even arranged a confidential discussion with former royal staff members who had left palace service due to ethical concerns about the institution. Each conversation added layers to William's understanding of the challenges Charlotte was facing. She wasn't simply dealing with school-age political discussions. She was confronting critiques of monarchy that had been developing among scholars and democratic theorists for decades. The questions her classmates were asking reflected sophisticated intellectual traditions that challenged the very foundations of hereditary power. But William's most difficult conversations were yet to come. As word of his unorthodox meetings began to circulate within palace circles, he faced increasingly serious confrontations with family members who saw his behavior as threatening the stability of the monarchy itself. The most serious confrontation came during a family gathering at Sandringham House in December. What was supposed to be a peaceful Christmas preparation became the setting for a family crisis that would reshape relationships for years to come. The immediate trigger was Charlotte's announcement that she no longer wanted to participate in traditional Christmas royal activities. She didn't want to attend the Christmas Day church service where people would bow and curtsy to the family. She didn't want to participate in the traditional Christmas broadcast preparation. Most significantly, she asked whether she could spend Christmas with school friends instead of participating in royal traditions. The request sent shockwaves through the extended royal family. Princess Anne, known for her direct communication style, confronted William during a private moment in the estate's library. "William," she said without preamble, "whatever you think you're accomplishing with these conversations you've been having, you're damaging Charlotte more than helping her. A child needs stability and clear identity, not philosophical uncertainty about her role in life." William had expected criticism from his aunt, but he was prepared with responses based on months of research and reflection. "Anne, Charlotte already has uncertainty about her role. She's questioning whether our family's position is morally defensible. I can either help her work through those questions honestly, or I can force her to suppress them and potentially damage her psychological development." Princess Anne's response reflected decades of royal service and unwavering commitment to duty. "William, we all had questions and doubts when we were young. The institution is bigger than any individual's concerns, even a beloved child's. Charlotte will learn to find purpose and meaning within her role, just as we all did." But William was no longer satisfied with appeals to tradition and institutional stability. "What if we were wrong, Anne? What if the way we learned to suppress our doubts and accept our roles was psychologically damaging? What if there's a better way for the next generation?" The conversation escalated quickly as other family members became involved. Prince Edward expressed concern about the constitutional implications of William's questioning. Sophie worried about the effects on the other royal children if Charlotte's rebellion became widely known. Even some of the newer family members, who had experienced their own challenges adapting to royal life, urged caution about undermining established protocols. The most painful confrontation came with King Charles himself, who had grown increasingly concerned about William's behavior and its potential impact on the monarchy's future. The conversation took place in Charles's private study at Sandringham, the same room where generations of royal family members had discussed matters of dynastic importance. "William," Charles began with unusual formality, "your mother and I have been discussing your recent investigations. We're concerned that your response to Charlotte's difficulties may be creating more problems than it solves." The mention of his mother stung William deeply. He had hoped that Camilla, having experienced her own challenges with royal criticism, might be more sympathetic to Charlotte's situation. The realization that even she was aligned with traditional approaches intensified his sense of isolation. "Father, Charlotte is suffering. She's asking questions about justice and fairness that deserve serious answers. If we can't provide those answers, maybe the problem isn't with her questions." Charles's response revealed the depth of his concern about the direction William was taking. "Son, the questions Charlotte is asking have been asked by critics of monarchy for centuries. If we start treating every criticism as potentially valid, we undermine our own legitimacy and purpose. Some questions are better left unexamined in the interest of institutional stability." William found himself questioning not just royal policy, but his relationship with his father. "Are you saying that protecting the institution is more important than protecting Charlotte's well-being?" The question hung in the air between them, representing a fundamental divide in priorities that threatened to fracture their relationship. Charles's answer would determine whether William could continue seeking change from within the royal family or whether he would need to consider more dramatic alternatives. "I'm saying," Charles replied carefully, "that Charlotte's well-being might be better served by helping her adapt to her role rather than questioning whether the role should exist at all." The response crystallized William's growing conviction that traditional royal approaches were inadequate for addressing contemporary challenges. His father was essentially asking him to prioritize institutional stability over his daughter's moral and psychological development. As the Christmas gathering continued, William found himself observing the royal family traditions with new eyes. He watched Charlotte participate reluctantly in activities that once brought her joy. He saw the careful choreography of public appearances that prioritized symbolism over authentic human connection. Most troubling, he witnessed the subtle ways that royal protocol discouraged honest conversation about difficult topics. The breaking point came during Christmas dinner, when one of Charlotte's cousins made an innocent comment about how lucky they were to be born into such a special family. Charlotte's response was quiet but devastating. "I don't think we're lucky," she said simply. "I think other people are unlucky that they have to live in a world where we get things they don't, just because of who our parents are." The comment created an awkward silence around the dinner table. Charlotte had articulated, with the clarity that only children possess, the fundamental moral challenge that William had been grappling with for months. Later that evening, as the family gathered for traditional Christmas activities, Charlotte approached her father with a request that would change everything. "Papa," she said quietly, "can we talk about whether I have to be a princess forever? Because I've been thinking, and I don't think I want to be one anymore." The request represented the culmination of months of questioning and struggle. Charlotte had moved beyond simply criticizing royal traditions to questioning whether she wanted to participate in them at all. William realized that his daughter was approaching a crossroads that would determine not just her own future, but possibly the future of the monarchy itself. As he looked into Charlotte's troubled but determined eyes, William made a decision that would require him to move beyond confronting palace advisors and family members to challenging the very legal and constitutional structures that defined their existence. The time for internal discussions and gradual reform had passed. If he wanted to protect his daughter's well-being and moral development, he would need to consider options that no royal family member had seriously contemplated in centuries. Charlotte's quiet declaration that she no longer wanted to be a princess marked the point of no return for William. The months of investigation, confrontation, and soul-searching had led to this moment, where his daughter was asking for something that seemed impossible within existing systems: the right to choose her own identity and future free from the constraints of inherited royal obligations. William spent the remaining days at Sandringham, observing Charlotte with new understanding. He watched her interact politely but distantly with visiting dignitaries who expected deference from a child. He saw her withdraw from conversations about future royal duties and traditional expectations. Most heartbreaking, he witnessed her careful attempts to hide her feelings to avoid causing family conflict. The realization that struck William most forcefully was that Charlotte's request wasn't unreasonable or childish. It was a legitimate assertion of basic human autonomy that happened to conflict with centuries of royal tradition. For the first time in his life, William began to seriously consider whether royal tradition might be wrong. The decision to explore radical alternatives crystallized during a private conversation with Catherine after they returned to Adelaide Cottage. Catherine had been observing the family dynamics during the Christmas gathering with growing concern, and her perspectives proved crucial in shaping William's final decision. "William," Catherine said as they sat in their living room after the children had gone to bed, "I've been watching Charlotte, and I'm genuinely worried about her psychological state. She's starting to exhibit signs of depression and anxiety that go beyond normal childhood adjustment issues." Catherine's background before marriage had given her a perspective on royal life that native-born family members sometimes lacked. She had experienced the transition from private citizen to royal family member, and her insights about the psychological costs of that transition were particularly valuable. "What do you think we should do?" William asked, though he suspected he knew where the conversation was heading. Catherine's response was more radical than anything William had heard from family members or palace advisors. "I think we need to consider whether Charlotte should have the option to step back from royal duties entirely. Not just reduce her obligations or modify her role, but actually choose whether she wants to be part of the royal family at all." The suggestion was revolutionary in its implications. No member of the direct line of succession had ever voluntarily relinquished their position for reasons other than scandal or constitutional crisis. The idea of allowing a royal child to choose their own path was unprecedented in British history. But as William considered Catherine's suggestion, it began to seem less radical and more obviously necessary. If Charlotte's distress was caused by being forced into a role she didn't choose and couldn't morally accept, then giving her genuine choice about that role might be the only way to protect her well-being. The practical challenges of implementing such a choice, however, were enormous. Charlotte was currently third in line to the throne after William and George. Her removal from the line of succession would require constitutional changes that had never been attempted for voluntary reasons. More significantly, it would establish precedents that could affect the entire future of the monarchy. William decided to seek legal advice about the possibilities for voluntary renunciation of royal titles and succession rights. The consultation was arranged through private legal channels to avoid creating public speculation about the royal family's internal discussions. Sir James Pemberton, a constitutional lawyer with decades of experience in royal affairs, received William's hypothetical questions with professional discretion, but obvious concern about their implications. "Your Royal Highness," Sir James explained during their confidential meeting, "while there are legal mechanisms for renouncing titles and succession rights, they have historically been used only in cases of constitutional crisis or scandal. Using them for voluntary personal choice would be unprecedented and potentially destabilizing." William pressed for specific information about the legal processes involved. "But it would be legally possible?" Sir James nodded reluctantly. "Yes, it would be possible. Parliament would need to pass legislation removing the individual from the line of succession, similar to what was done for Edward VIII, though obviously under very different circumstances. The individual could also renounce their royal titles through letters patent issued by the Crown. The legal consultation revealed that Charlotte could theoretically be given a genuine choice about her royal future, though the political and constitutional complications would be extraordinary. William began to see a path forward that would protect his daughter's autonomy while acknowledging the broader implications for the monarchy. But before pursuing such dramatic legal changes, William decided to attempt one final conversation with the senior royal family members to explore whether meaningful reform might be possible within existing structures. He arranged a private family meeting at Windsor Castle, including King Charles, Queen Camilla, and senior working royals. The meeting was held in the Green Drawing Room, a space historically used for important family discussions. William came prepared with documentation from his months of investigation, legal research about options for voluntary renunciation, and most importantly, a clear articulation of what he saw as the choice facing the royal family. "I want to discuss Charlotte's future and what I believe are fundamental questions about the monarchy's relationship with democratic values," William began, noting the immediate tension his opening statement created in the room. He proceeded to outline his findings about Charlotte's psychological state, the broader social and political context of her struggles, and his growing conviction that traditional approaches were inadequate for addressing contemporary challenges to royal legitimacy. "I believe we face a choice," William concluded. "We can continue with traditional approaches and hope that Charlotte and future generations will adapt to roles they didn't choose and may not want. Or we can acknowledge that inheriting royal obligations without consent raises serious moral questions that deserve serious solutions." King Charles's response reflected months of his own consideration of these issues.
William, what you're describing sounds like the voluntary dissolution of the monarchy.
If royal children can choose whether to accept their roles, then the entire system of inherited constitutional authority collapses. William had anticipated this objection, and his response revealed how far his thinking had evolved.
Father, maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe a system that depends on people accepting roles they didn't choose is inherently problematic and deserves to collapse.
The statement sent shockwaves through the assembled family members. William was no longer advocating for reform within the monarchy. He was questioning whether the monarchy should continue to exist at all. Queen Camilla, who had remained quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke. William, have you considered the millions of people who support the monarchy and find value in royal traditions? Are you prepared to override their preferences because of one child's concerns? William's response reflected his months of research into public opinion and democratic theory. Camilla, I've been studying public support for the monarchy, and it's not as solid as palace communications suggest. Among younger generations, support is declining significantly. Charlotte's concerns may be ahead of broader social changes, not contrary to them. The family meeting continued for hours, with various members raising objections to William's increasingly radical proposals. They argued about constitutional stability, public expectations, financial implications, and the effects on other Commonwealth realms that recognise the British monarch as their head of state. But William had become convinced that protecting Charlotte's well-being required acknowledging the legitimacy of her moral objections to inherited privilege. He was no longer willing to sacrifice his daughter's psychological development for institutional stability. The meeting ended without resolution, but with a clear understanding that William was prepared to pursue dramatic alternatives if the family couldn't find ways to address Charlotte's concerns within existing structures. In the weeks following the family meeting, William began quietly implementing a plan that would give Charlotte genuine choices about her future while acknowledging the broader implications for the monarchy. The plan involved several components that would unfold over time. First, William arranged for Charlotte to receive counseling from child psychologists who specialized in helping young people navigate complex identity issues. The goal was to ensure that any decisions about her future were made with proper psychological support and understanding of the implications. Second, he began discreet conversations with constitutional scholars and political leaders about the possibilities for voluntary renunciation of royal roles and the broader implications for monarchical succession. These conversations were carefully structured to avoid creating public speculation while exploring genuine options. Most significantly, William decided to begin preparing Charlotte for the possibility of choosing her own path by engaging her in age-appropriate discussions about citizenship, democracy, and personal autonomy. Rather than expecting her to suppress her questions about fairness and privilege, he began helping her understand how democratic societies handled questions of power and accountability. The breakthrough came during a father-daughter conversation in early January, when Charlotte expressed frustration about having to return to school and faced continued questions about her family's position. "Papa," she said, "I've been thinking about our talks, and I want to know if I decide I don't want to be a princess when I grow up. Would that be okay with you?" William's response marked a definitive break with royal tradition and family expectations. "Charlotte, I want you to know that your happiness and your ability to live according to your own values are more important to me than any royal traditions or expectations. If you decide you want to choose a different path, I will support you completely." The conversation continued with William explaining to his daughter that such choices would be complicated and would require careful planning and legal changes. But he also made clear that her autonomy and well-being were his primary concerns, regardless of the institutional implications. Charlotte's response was immediate and profound relief. For the first time in months, she seemed to relax the careful self-control that had marked her behavior since the crisis began. The knowledge that she had genuine choices about her future allowed her to engage with her current situation without the psychological burden of feeling trapped in a role she couldn't morally accept. As word of William's decision spread through palace circles, the reaction was swift and dramatic. Some family members and advisors saw his approach as responsible parenting that prioritized child welfare. Others viewed it as a fundamental betrayal of royal duty that could destabilize the monarchy itself. The most significant reaction came from King Charles, who requested an urgent private meeting with William to discuss the implications of giving Charlotte genuine choice about her royal future. "William," Charles said during their meeting, "if Charlotte chooses to renounce her royal role, it establishes precedents that could affect George, Louis, and future generations of royal children. You're potentially dismantling the entire system of hereditary monarchy." William's response reflected months of careful thought about exactly these implications. "Father, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Maybe a system that depends on people accepting roles without genuine choice is inherently unfair and deserves to be dismantled. The conversation marked a definitive break between William and the traditional royal establishment. He was no longer seeking to reform the monarchy from within. He was preparing to support his daughter's choice, even if it meant fundamentally changing or ending the monarchical system itself. As the story drew to its conclusion, William found himself in a position that no heir to the throne had ever occupied. He was prepared to prioritize his child's psychological well-being and moral development over institutional stability and family tradition. The long-term implications of this choice remained uncertain, but William had made peace with the possibility that protecting Charlotte might require sacrificing the very institution he'd been born to serve. The final conversation of this phase of their story took place on a quiet evening at Adelaide Cottage, with Charlotte curled up next to her father as they talked about her future and the choices she would eventually need to make. "Papa," Charlotte said, "thank you for listening to my questions and taking them seriously. Even if I don't know yet what I want to choose, it feels good to know that I'll get to choose." William's response captured the transformation that his daughter's pain had created in his understanding of parenthood, duty, and justice. "Charlotte, your questions about fairness and choice are some of the most important questions anyone can ask. Whatever you decide about your future, I'm proud of you for thinking so carefully about what kind of person you want to be and what kind of world you want to live in." The story's conclusion was not an ending but a beginning, the start of a process that would allow Charlotte to develop her own relationship with questions of privilege, service, and citizenship, free from the psychological burden of roles imposed without consent. Whether her choices would ultimately strengthen or transform the monarchy remained to be seen, but William had ensured that those choices would be genuinely hers to make.